Today is Tuesday. It's October the 25th, 2022. The title of this devotional is A Shepherd's Call to Holiness. Now, I need to make a word of apology. As you'll notice, the background is different. My wife and I are traveling, and so I'm coming to you from a hotel room. However, this devotional is taken from 2 Corinthians chapter 7, and I appreciate you continuing to join me. Now, the verses prior to 2 Corinthians chapter 7 were a practical directive for all believers that we should heed. If you'll notice verses 14 through 17 of 2 Corinthians chapter 6, it dealt with the issue of consorting or partnering with unbelievers. Now, Paul admonished the believers in Corinth in verse 14, "Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness?" Now let's talk about the matter of a yoke for a moment. The yoke really is hearkening back to a tool that would have been made of wood and borne by oxen in tandem working a farmer's field. Now, scriptures forbid a farmer attempting to work a field with an ox and a donkey, for instance. And so the natures and the temperaments of those beasts are different, as are their gaits. An unequal tandem, then, of beast would have caused chafing to their skins and proved detrimental to their work and well-being. Well, the same is true when believers make an unwise decision to yoke with unbelievers in an endeavor or enterprise. Sadly, some believers violate Paul's admonition and learn those who love righteousness cannot fellowship with the unrighteous, as you look at verse 14. In the same way, light and darkness do not coexist. The believer who disregards Paul's warning of being unequally yoked will find unequal marriages, families, businesses experiencing the consequences of being spiritually unequally yoked. Well, as you look at verse 17, then calling upon believers to come out from among them, among unbelievers, and be ye separate. And then God promised in the latter part of 17 and verse 18 of 2 Corinthians chapter 6, these words, "I will receive you, and will be a father unto you, and ye shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty." Now that is the introduction now to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Now keep it in mind, God's promise that He will be a father, and we who are believers will be His spiritual sons and daughters. Paul declares in verse 1, the Lord's expectations for believers to cleanse themselves from sin and live holy lives, and I quote, in the fear of God, 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 1. Well, murmuring and complaining and criticisms, you see, are the lot of all in leadership, and the church is certainly no exception. And so as we begin to read verses 2 through 6, Paul apparently is dealing with a congregation who had taken the words of his first letter and taken offense to them. And so Paul, in verses 2 through 6 of 2 Corinthians 7, urges those estranged believers to be reconciled to him. In fact, in his defense, you look at verse 2, he declares, "We have wronged no man. We have corrupted no man. We have defrauded no man." And then Paul, in verse 3, continues, "I speak not this to condemn you, for I have said before that ye are in our hearts to die and live with you." Now think about that expression. What a wonderful sentiment of a spiritual shepherd's love for his flock. Yes, of necessity, he had rebuked the Corinthians for tolerating gross wickedness in the congregation. We found that in 1 Corinthians 5. Nevertheless, his strong words rose from the heart of a minister who loved them and would give his life for them, as you read in verse 3. Now, there must have been some who accused Paul of being unloving in his first letter, and to them he affirmed in verse 4, "Great is my boldness of speech toward you, but great is my glorying of you. I am filled with comfort. I am exceeding joyful in all our tribulation," or in all our trials. Now, here's a closing thought for you and an application. As you look at verses 5 through 6, I fear the culture of the 21st century that has little tolerance for preachers who dare confront the prevalent sins of our day. What is true of the culture, sadly, is true of the church. Tragically, there are many pastors unwilling to contend with the sins and the failings of their congregation. Their failure has perpetuated a carnality in churches that is destroying lives, marriages, families, and our institutions, Bible colleges, Bible universities. Let me say this. If your church is blessed to have pastors and teachers like Paul, who are willing to confront sin, be thankful, for they're willing to do that which God would have them to do. Unloving, some might accuse. However, remember, the Apostle Paul was not spared from the same accusations. Well, so much more might be written in 2 Corinthians 7, but Lord willing, that'll be something we deal with in another day, perhaps in another year. I pray that these observations will encourage you to be a devout, holy, godly people. Value those who dare to do God's work and confront sins in a culture and even within the church. Thank you for joining me for this Heart of a Shepherd. God bless.